Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Andzelika Duda. Everyone calls me Andy here, just much easier to say. So my presentation is about how viruses in general affect humans, and we'll talk a little bit about COVID and also the flu and how they compare. So first of all, let's get some definitions out of the way. Exposure, by exposure we mean any contact with virus via blood, saliva, feces, contamination of food or water, insect bites, or as the case is with COVID, aerosol droplets. And in a newfound virus, the exposure is usually to an infected animal. And when we talk about cross-species transmission, which you might have heard before, that is when a virus that starts in one animal can move on to a different animal. And a lot of viruses that we find in humans usually start in animals. And so exposure to that animal must happen for transmission to occur. So then we move on to hosts. A virus needs a host to survive, and a host can be any living organism that can be infected with the virus. And the reason that the virus needs that host is because the virus isn't actually quite alive, and it needs something else, a living organism there, to actually be able to replicate. So here is a little interactive piece. I think you will have to unmute yourself if you want to answer this question, because I will not be able to see any chat answers. So what do you think are the barriers to cross-species transmission? Any takers? No? Okay, right. So the first one that we talk about is genetic. And that is when viruses can't actually bind to human cells. And in order to cross that barrier, the virus has to undergo some mutations in the DNA. And the other barrier that we talk about is environmental. And all that means is when a virus is in one animal, and the virus doesn't even come anywhere near humans, then it can't actually transmit onto the human because they're nowhere near each other. So now we're going to talk about something I call HIP. And that's just a little simple explanation of what happens to the virus in the body. So start with our host, and this is a little old lady that I'll call Jane. And she is just minding her own business, walking around, and the virus is looking for a new host. So it sees Jane and it enters Jane's body. So then what happens is the virus is looking for cells that it can bind to. And once it finds a cell like that, it will just attach to it. And you can think of it as kind of a puzzle piece, because not every virus can attach to every cell. So the virus has to find a matching puzzle piece to actually attach to that cell. Then what happens is what we call insertion. And this is when a virus inserts a copy of its genetic material into the host cell. So this would be Jane's cells that receive this genetic material from the virus. And then the cell that has received the genetic material will produce whatever the genetic material is telling it to. So it can, you can think of it kind of as a recipe. And the cell receives that recipe and it reads the recipe, and then it will produce whatever it tells it to. And that can be pretty much anything. Usually it's part of the virus, which we'll talk about a little later. So now, how does it actually cause disease? So what happens is the immune system will initially try to fight back the infection. And this happens by the cells either being destroyed directly by the immune cells, or some processes will start that will destroy the cells. And this can actually produce organ damage if the immune response is very severe. And that is kind of what happens in COVID. And I do have a slide on it as well, so hang on with that thought. And another thing that happens is the virus can use up a lot of the cell's energy when it replicates. So when the virus tells the cell to do certain actions, the cell will use up a lot of its energy to produce those materials. And because so much energy is used up, the normal cell, can use the energy to perform its normal function, which then means that the organ is unable to work properly. And this is a beautiful picture of our very well known now coronavirus. And with coronavirus, what happens is the virus can actually attach to one type of cell in the body, but this type of cell is found in different organs, and we can find it in the lungs, we can find it in our nose, in our throat, and we can also find it in the kidneys, the liver, and the intestines. And because of that, we get a lot of different symptoms, such as the fever and headache, loss of taste or smell, difficulty breathing, cough, and diarrhea, nausea, muscle aches. So there's a lot of different symptoms because of how many organs the virus can actually affect. And so this is a lovely picture that I've stolen off of someone. I did give them credit, don't worry. And it shows alveoli. This is what we call alveoli. And alveoli are little kind of airways in our lungs. So they're the smallest part of our lungs, and that's what makes up the airways. And they kind of, so the alveoli, that is where gas exchange happens. So when we talk about how we breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide, this is where it happens. And from this lovely picture, you can see my beautiful diagram of it. That is not copyrighted this time. So here I kind of have marked different parts, and I will go through this diagram with you now. So this is what happens in the coronavirus when we get infected, and it doesn't necessarily happen to everyone. It can happen to a larger extent in some people, and this is what causes a lot of the deaths due to coronavirus. So first of all, the coronavirus will enter the alveoli. So these are the gas exchange kind of balloons, I would describe it as, in our lungs. And then what happens is our immune system will see that virus, and it kind of says, oh, I don't know that thing that's in my body, what do I do? And it tries to, it would try to fight it back. So it does that by producing something called cytokines. And it is a very fancy word for a very simple thing. Cytokines basically attract other immune cells. That's all it does. So then the immune cells will actually start attacking the virus again and attract more cytokines. So now the issue with this is that when there's so much fighting going on, when the immune cells attack so many different cells and viruses in our body, it can actually produce scar tissue in our lungs. And that's what causes oxygen to be obstructed from entering the bloodstream. So when we talk about oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide comes out, there's a barrier of the scar tissue, so the oxygen can't actually enter our bloodstream. So next, this is a picture of the seasonal flu virus. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So the main differences with the seasonal flu virus to COVID is that with the flu, it mainly affects the upper respiratory tract, which is your nose, your throat, basically anything above the lungs. And this, because it is limited to mainly one area of our body, it produces a much milder disease than coronavirus. But on the other hand, it does spread faster than the coronavirus. And usually people who get the flu don't get as ill as people who get COVID. So a lower proportion of people who get the flu will actually develop a severe disease than in COVID-19. And with mortality rate, we talk about it a lot, we see it on the news a lot, but the truth is that it's a bit too early to tell exactly what the mortality rate is. So currently it is estimated to be between 3 and 4% of everyone who gets COVID-19 that dies. So about 3 to 4% people who get COVID-19 will die. Whereas with the seasonal flu, it's only about 0.1%, if not less than that. And that's just the seasonal flu that we get. So COVID-19 is much more severe of a virus than just the flu. And this is our last little subsection. So we talk about transmission of viruses. And transmission is simply when the virus spreads from one person to the other. So what happens here is, right, these statistics, these were published on the 1st of December. And so up to then, we had almost 62 million worldwide infections of coronavirus. And out of that, 1.5 million people died. And it just shows how fast the virus can spread, because it started only in December last year. And already we have had 62 million infections and 1.5 million deaths from this virus, which is quite severe. And so the virus, when, as we've talked about before, the virus will infect the cells, and the cells will then produce different parts of the virus. And these parts will be produced and then put together to make a new virus. It's still coronavirus, but it will be just its replication. So it's the exact same virus, it's just another one of it. So the virus will be produced and it will be put together, and it will stay in the body until it is ready to leave the body. And when it is ready to leave the body, the virus will basically move up anywhere where it can exit our body. So for example, with COVID, usually that happens via coughing or sneezing. So the virus will sit in our lungs until you cough or you sneeze, and then it will be released, and it will try to find another host, and that's how it will spread to a different person. And I think that is it about transmission. So thank you very much. If you've got any questions, I shall go back to our Zoom call now. So feel free to ask them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and speak to me. Thank you very much.